Okay. Good evening. Is it on?
Yeah.
Can you hear me? Okay. Testing, testing. Can you hear me? Doesn't seem that loud. Hello? Maybe I'll just, can I take this off and just hold it? Okay. Good evening, everyone. If you would happen to grab your drink, coffee, tea, water, and find yourself a seat, we'd like to get started this evening. First off, thank you to everybody who's come out this evening in this dark evening. And a special welcome to those of you who are visiting our center for the first time and participated in a tour earlier today. I'd first like to acknowledge that we are gathered today on the land, on the unceded territory of the Coast Salish people, including the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish nations. This is an area of work, this process of reconciliation that ISS of BC have embraced and have started a long journey a number of years ago. Given the importance of immigration on the one hand in this country, but also on the other hand, the lack of awareness among newcomers to Indigenous peoples of Canada. So this is part of this long journey that we are on. I'd also like to point out for those of you that are involved in social media that we have a hashtag, hashtag Closer Look 2019. We put this series on. This is the third now of a three-part series that we launched this fall to better understand the dynamics around immigration. For those of us that work in the immigrant serving sector, it can feel a bit like an echo chamber where we are talking to ourselves. And given the complexity and the dynamics of immigration on this country and the real lack of debate and discussion on the importance and the changes that immigration is having on this country, we embarked on this series called A Closer Look to provide an opportunity to the public, to our neighbors, local residents, an opportunity to roll up your sleeves and dig deeper on the multidimensional aspects of immigration and what it means. And so we have been thrilled now this past fall to have Douglas Todd speak to the whole area of unity in the metropolis of enclaves back in September. Then Catherine DeVerne, the Dean of the UBC Law School, spoke about compassion law and why refugee claims matter. And of course, you're going to hear in a few minutes from our third and last speaker in the series, Shachi Kurl. I wanted to get a sense from within the room, if you could raise your hand, if this is the first time that you are visiting the center here. How many are first time? Okay, great. Great. Also, could you raise your hand if you participated in any of the preceding speakers? Wow. Okay, great. That's fantastic. Thank you so much. So here we are in Canada. We just finished a federal election recently. There was a number of opinion polls undertaken by various firms, and one of the not so surprising aha moments, which Shachi Kurl is going to dig deeper for us, was the whole perception of immigration in this country, who is coming in, the numbers, and so forth. And it was not surprising some of the opinions that emerged in these polls. And so we're fortunate, again, to have Shachi Kurl here. She is the executive director of the Angus Reid Institute, And if you had your device and if you had internet and if you were watching CBC at issue, you could watch her simultaneously as she's presenting tonight. So for those of you who want to hear more from her, you can run home to the National and watch her. But of course, because we live in a large country with a number of time zones, she's already spoken to those back east and they're heading to bed. Now, Shachi has, as I said, offered analysis on CBC's At Issue, in the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, the Globe and Mail, and on the editorial pages of the Ottawa Citizen, among other places. At the Angus Reid Institute, Canada's non-profit foundation committed to independent research, she works with public opinion data to further public knowledge and enhance the national understanding of issues that matter to Canada and the world. She spent the first part of her career as a political reporter and holds a degree in journalism and political science from Carleton University. Shachi is a recipient of the prestigious Jack Webster Award for Best TV Reporting. Along with former Australian and UK Prime Ministers Julian Gillard and Margaret Thatcher, she's an alumni of the US State Department's International Visitors Leadership Program. Her expertise has been sought by policymakers who have invited her to testify before parliamentary committees at the House of Commons. So without further ado, I would like all of us to welcome Shachi to the podium. Okay. Now I will put it back in. Okay. And of course you can adjust it.
Well, thank you, Chris, for that warm welcome. I always just sort of send my bio in whole and say, please shorten this. And then, because it sounds a little pretentious when it's all read out, but you gotta say what you've done in your life, I guess. For those of you at the back, don't be shy. Come on up. It saves me having to throw my voice. So if you do feel like moving up a little, I invite you to with all warmth and sincerity. So please come on up. Just a couple of personal notes to start the evening and to frame the evening. I am the daughter of immigrants and very grateful every day that I won the lottery of birth as a result of their somewhat astute but somewhat accidental choices. They were very much the accidental immigrants to Canada. They always thought they'd end up in the States, but wouldn't you know it, just like in 2019, visa issues meant that they had to look elsewhere for permanent residency. They got to Vancouver and basically looked at the ocean and said, we're not leaving. And next year for them will be a big number of years in Canada. They arrived in 1970, so wow. And I was lucky enough to be born here. Chris talks about all the stuff I do, you know, here, there, and everywhere. I'm just a nice girl originally from Kitsilano and then from Richmond. So that's a little bit of who I am. This has been an interesting couple of days, hasn't it? So I like to watch hockey. Does anyone else like to watch hockey? And we heard what we heard from Grapes, sounding a little bit like sour grapes today, from Don Cherry, and it has been a moment of reckoning. I don't wish to sound too gleeful, or I don't want to sound gleeful at all. It's always so discomforting when either you've been born in this country or you are making a home in this country, having taken the very brave decision to go and start life anew and leave everything that is familiar and comfortable to you, and to yet have to constantly prove your credentials. But as the children of immigrants, as immigrants in this room, as the grandchildren of immigrants, those of you in this room, you know that that's something for many of us that doesn't actually ever end. And so I ended up tweeting a photo of myself and a couple of colleagues of color, and we were all children of immigrants. We all had our poppies on, and I was like, hey, we paid for them too. And how much longer are we going to have to? But it is what it is. Immigration, for many reasons, has been an area of interest to me. You've heard a little bit about the personal. From a professional standpoint, what I notice as a journalist in my heart and continuing in my heart in practicality for better than a dozen years, and now as someone who deals in data and does a lot of the same work around inquiry and understanding answers, but doing it from more a sociological perspective and a more empirical perspective, I find that, as with so many conversations in this country today, we are pulling to two sides, and the center is being lost. And so it was very important to me to look at this issue a year ago, coming off of the heels of some of the polling and survey work we had done on the initial resettlement of Syrian refugees in 2015, 16, and onwards. Then the situation around the irregular border crossers and the phenomenon we saw around that in the ensuing years, and also just at immigration as a whole writ large, where you had the leader of one party who was trying to say that he wasn't a fringe party, but ended up being very much a fringe party, and Maxime Bernier and the People's Party, ostensibly saying, well, I just want to have a debate about immigration in this last election. And what was so interesting about that is, hey, why can't we have conversations about immigration? Why can't we ask, what's the right number? Or what are the right candidates to boost our economy? Or who should we be focusing on? Those are questions that we should be able to ask in a way that doesn't devolve into absolute shouting matches and insanity. And yet we're seemingly losing our ability to do that in Canada. And so that's been something that's been of concern to me, of interest to me, and something that I've wanted to understand and measure, because it feels like you're getting very different realities of what the picture of immigration is in this country, depending on which news organization's website you go to these days. So with that, I'll tell you a little bit. Chris did a lovely job of framing it, a little bit about, there we go, about who we are. Many of you may be familiar with the name of our chairman, Angus Reid. He's kind of the grandfather of polling in this country. He is a real person, calls me about 7 times a day, just talked to him before we walked in. How's it going? Who are you talking to tonight? What's it going to be about? It's good when you've got a chairman who takes great, prodigious care and interest in the work that you do. And I say that very sincerely. And I credit him for doing something really unique about 5 years ago. What we did was we moved from commercial operations, where you do polling just for clients and for political parties and for the cell phone companies and for the running shoe companies and for the cereal companies. Well, cereal's passé, but the coffee chains, the airlines. And we wanted to focus our survey work exclusively on policy and social issues in this country. And so that's a pretty big umbrella. And it means we get to ask things that are fun and interesting, but we also get to ask about pretty serious stuff. What's important to remember is all of the data we put out, you can access off of our website. There's no firewall. You don't have to pay for anything. If you're so interested, go and please avail yourself of what's there. If you're a student, if you're a researcher in that space, have a look. And nobody pays for what we do. We pay for what we do. We try to emulate ourselves a little bit like on the Pew Research Center in the United States and be those honest brokers in terms of survey work, because again, in the commercial space, in an era, in a world where everyone's after using polling to create a headline, we want to use polling to actually expose what's really going on in the hearts and minds of people. I'm going to take you through a couple of things, and then I hope we can have a discussion at the end about one element that I haven't included here because I just didn't want to bombard you with slides tonight. So we'll start with global views of immigration, because I think it's important to contextualize what it is that we're feeling in this country and what does that look like relative to other parts of the world. We will focus on those Canadian views. We'll look at a little bit of the impact of the election and what could be coming next. And then, as I say, the piece that I want to hopefully have a bit of a further conversation about has been the role and the intersectionality of immigration, and then the phenomena of the border crossers in the last couple of years, and how that's had an impact. And then, of course, I'm happy to take your questions. So when we look at what's happening in the world, you see a map there. Don't worry about the numbers so much. I'm going to say that a lot because I'm realizing some of you at the back of the room are going to have a really hard time reading some of this up here. So don't worry about the numbers. Just let me tell you what it means. The darker colored countries are the ones that are more anti-immigration and or immigration skeptical. So the Russias, different parts of the Africas, you see a lot of the Europes, particularly the Eastern Europes, more likely to say, we'd like to see less immigration or no immigration to our country. The blank colored countries, the ones that are more neutral toned, are more likely to say, let's basically leave levels at what they are or increase them only slightly. The ones in green, and you see Canada there, you see Australia, and see some other countries where the view is, no, we actually need more people coming to our country. When we look at Europe, and certainly a lot of the conversation around populism, around anti-immigration sentiment, hear about what's happening in Poland, you hear about what's happening in the Czech Republic, you hear about what's happening in Germany, certainly Greece, other parts of Europe, as it has dealt with an influx of people coming to Europe, particularly from war-ravaged parts of Northern Africa and the Middle East. You see that Europe in itself is also divided in terms of how they view the immigration proposition. In Western Europe, people are much more likely to say, let's either keep it at the present level or increase, although a significant number, about half, also say decrease or just shut it down. But as you go into Eastern Europe and into Southern Europe, those numbers really drop off. So when we think about the Britons, the Frances, the Germanys, the Norways, the Swedens, no one's really asking for a lot more at this time, but they are pretty content at where the levels are. When we think about Eastern Europe, when we think about Southern Europe, the Italys, the Spains, the Greeces, again, there's a desire to really see numbers decrease. Here's a statement. Two statements that were put in front of people by Pew Research from many countries around the world. Which statement comes closer to your view today? Immigrants today are either a burden on our country or make our country stronger. When we think about OECD nations, when we think about Western European nations, when we think about G7 nations, these are nations that are much more likely, the ones that allow immigration, to say that they make our country stronger. Certainly you see majorities there. Canada at the top with 68%. This is in surveys that was conducted by Pew this year, followed by Australia, the UK, Sweden, Japan, the US, Germany, Mexico, Spain, and France. Those aren't all the countries, but some comparable ones just in terms of where we live or who we deal with. But you will note across that column all the way down, you also see no fewer than about 30% of populations in each of those countries saying immigrants are actually a burden to our country, and that rises all the way to about 40% in France. So when we think, the reason I'm sharing this is because when we think about and when we get into what Canadians are thinking, it's important to have the context around it. So in some ways, certainly the media, certainly when we think about those on the progressive left, when we think about those in the advocacy realm, present company excluded, Chris, there can often be a reactive sense of, well, of course everyone in this country values immigration. Everybody does. Well, not everybody. More, certainly the majority. But when you think about 3 in 10, think about your yoga class, think about your bridge club, think about your own family, think about Christmas dinner if you're going to have 10 there. 3 of the people in that room are going to have a different perspective on this, and their perspective is we should really be questioning the value of immigration to the country. And I'm going to leave that statement with you because we're going to come back to it in a little while. So here's a little bit more about Europe. I'm going to come to Canada now. And I think it's important to set up Canadian immigration trends. Now, many of you in this room are probably very familiar with these numbers, but Canadians themselves, and we found this in terms of the polling work we did just in the last couple of weeks during the election campaign, are totally all over the map when it comes to how many people are coming into the country, where they're coming from, and under which class, either economic class, family reunification, or humanitarian, under which class they're coming. So what this shows you, does this thing have a little laser pointer thingy? Oh, it does. It's really tiny. But if you can see these little polka dots, these are moments in time where we saw changes in government, in majority governments. And that just goes to show where you can sometimes see changes in policy. So right here around 1984, you see government change. These are the Brian Mulroney years, and you see immigration really increase in this country. And we continued that way until the early 1990s. We get the Chrétien years and a reduction, a significant reduction in the number of immigrants being accepted into the country. Immigration rules were tightened up. Family reunification rules were really tightened up at that time. There was a landing fee that was applied, very controversial. At the time, it was called a modern-day head tax. And what was interesting about the cross-section of politics in immigration was that the Liberal Party drew, and still does, a lot of its support from new Canadians and relatively new Canadians, and had for certainly up until that time been the natural home of first-generation Canadians and Canadians who had come from other countries and were voting often for the first time, or you know, I think about the Ismaili refugees who were settled under the Trudeau years. There had been a loyalty to the Liberal brand, which kind of went out the window when Chrétien made that change in terms of policy. Oops, God, okay. The laser pointer isn't working anymore. Never mind. So the next polka dot you see is a change again to the Harper years. And you can see there that immigration at this point is, it's not fluctuating much, but in any case, it's now starting to take a steady rise. And the Harper conservatives were the first political movement on the right of center to figure out that immigrants and people of color vote for more conservative-minded policies as well, and really tapped into that. And then, of course, you see a change finally with that last polka dot, 2015, Justin Trudeau, and he had announced a very ambitious plan to significantly increase and get aggressive about the number of immigrants coming into the country. At the same time, the line you see at the bottom represents what immigration, net immigration, looks like as a percentage of the population overall. And I would just point out that even though that top line continues to be very craggy but trend upwards, that bottom line still has our overall percentage of population of immigrants to the country at less than 1%. So important to put that into perspective and into context. Now, we ask Canadians, how many new immigrants do you think arrived in Canada in the last year? 20% got it right. That number is 331,000. But a significant number thought that it was way more. So about 10% thought it was 500,000 or more. You had about 10% who also thought it was upwards of 400,000. And you had a significant number who were in the right range, thinking it was somewhere between 300,000 and 400,000. So while 1 in 5 actually thought it was way less than that. So Canadians, what does that say? Well, I'm not going to beat them up for not being informed about exact immigration statistics, but what it says to me is there's a fair level of lack of numeracy when it comes to actual numbers and what that represents as a percentage of the population. That said, we explained, actually it's 331,000 and it's just under 1%. What do you think about that? Do you think that's too many? Do you think it's about right? Do you think it should be more? So that first bar at 13% represents the number who say it's too few. We should be bringing more. About 40%, 2 in 5, say, we got it right. It's right. Let's keep it as it is. Let's stick on this track. But the equal number say, it's too many. The number should be lower. Regionally, we see some distinct differences. So on the far end, you have that total bar graph. And next over is British Columbia, where people, along with the national average, are more inclined to say it's either not enough folks or it's just about right. You hit the prairies. You hit Saskatchewan and Manitoba. You see people far more likely to say it's too many. The further you go, Quebec is very interesting because Quebec is actually divided by between saying it's about right and also saying too many or we need more. So what that says to me is these are not issues and viewpoints that are necessarily really focused depending on where you live in the country, although you do see some changes regionally. It tends to follow a trend from coast to coast. What does drive opinion on this is political ideology. So this is some polling taken from a study that we did during the election campaign, about 2 weeks before the campaign ended. Over on the far side, those are conservative voters, 65% of whom told us this number is too many. Two-thirds of Conservative Party voters. Liberal voters, very good, sticking by their party's policy on the issue. The majority said, it's just right, it's perfect. Among NDP voters, they're interestingly quite split between saying too few, about right, but you know what was notable to me is 1 in 5 also said it's too many. So again, when we think about the rhetoric and we think about who is speaking for whom in this debate, remember that some of your friends on the progressive left also think that we have too many immigrants coming into the country, and it's a significant number of them, 1 in 5. Greens are pretty split evenly, and the Bloc, again, in Quebec, nobody's really saying we need to bring more immigrants. They're much more likely to say either just right or too many, and they're evenly split on that front. Here's a really fun graph. I know, fun with graphs, right? We asked people what their perceptions were of the class of immigrant that was coming into the country, and we compared that with the actual proportion. So the perceived proportion is the dark bar, the actual proportion is the lighter colored one. Think about the economic class of immigrant, people who are coming to work, to study, to do jobs, to look after us. Thank you. To build the tax base and pay into CPP so that some of y'all can retire. Thank you. Thank you. They actually represent Nearly 60% of all newcomers coming to Canada. 6 in 10 of them. The vast majority. But when you ask Canadians, how many are in that economic class, they vastly underestimate that. They think it's way lower. They think it's only about 40%. Conversely, on the other end of this, you've got the refugee or humanitarian class of immigrant, representing 15% of actual newcomers to Canada in the last year. But people perceive that number to be double what it is. So again, we have some real misconceptions around who's coming and why they're coming. When we ask, okay, so that's what you think about who's coming. Here's the actual proportion in terms of those classes of immigrant. Now, what do you think? Should we have more or fewer economic class? Should we have more or fewer family and reunification class? Should we have more or fewer refugee and humanitarian class? For the most part, you see people either saying we need more economic class immigrants or the number's about right. For the most part, you see people, when it comes to family class Canadians across the country, they're more likely to say either the number's right or we should be decreasing it. And when it comes to refugee and humanitarian class, again, you see some big divisions. There isn't a lot of consensus. 1 in 3 Canadians would like to see the number of refugee and humanitarian class newcomer reduced. That's the highest out of any class. But at the same time, 1 in 5 would say, actually, we need to up this number. Okay, there's a lot going on here. But this is a very pretty map, and we worked really hard on it. And what it describes, and you know what we'll do is, Chris, if you guys want this this presentation on your website, if you want to post it, we can absolutely do that so that people can access it. The red bars next to these countries represent the percentage who say that this is where most immigrants are coming from. The black bar represents actually where most immigrants are coming from. So the one I want to point your attention to is the Middle East and North Africa. 2/3 of Canadians are of the view that this is where most immigrants to Canada are coming from, where in fact it represents only 12% of immigration to the country. By contrast, as I think most of us know, the majority of the people who are settling in this country are coming from South and Southeast Asia, from the Indian subcontinent, and from places like the USA and Mexico, from Latin America, even from Africa. And of course, there's a smattering from Europe. But we know in Vancouver that most of our newcomers are coming from that Pacific Rim and Indian subcontinent area. And yet, when you ask the question, where are they coming from? Everyone's saying, the Middle East. Wow, that was a wow for me. It's unusual, you know, it's like everyone's got things they get really excited about. I'm a super nerd, so the data tables come in. I'm like, oh, open, 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 open. And I like to find out what I'm going to be surprised by. I try to keep a very blank slate in terms of what I expect to see. That was a yowza moment for me. So then you ask the question, okay, well, where should immigrants to Canada be coming from, in your opinion? Opinions are not always right, but they are opinions, and guess what? They're being espoused pretty robustly in the media, online, in social media, whether we like it or not. So we might as well have an airing of people's opinions. We might as well understand what they think. Now, the good news is 50% of the country says it actually shouldn't matter where people come from at all. And that increases to 64% in places like Saskatchewan. They're most likely to say this. In BC, it's 60%, above the national average. In Quebec, it's down to 35%. Quebec is an outlier on this question in many ways. But when you get away from the folks who say it doesn't matter, they can come from anywhere, what are the top answers that are offered specifically? Europe, the USA and Mexico, Latin America and the Caribbean. Let's look at that by political affiliation. Let's understand what's going on. Why do people want these numbers and newcomers to be coming from places like Europe? Could it have something to do with language? Could it have something to do with linguistic facility? So during the election, again, we asked the question, do you agree or disagree with the statement, all new immigrants to Canada, at least those who are not refugees, understanding that when you are a refugee fleeing a war zone, you probably don't have time for language lessons, should speak at least some English or French. Nationally, 62% of Canadians said that, the majority, about 2/3, said yes. To come to this country, you should be able to speak some English or French. Those numbers are highest among those who were voting for the Conservatives and those who were voting for the Bloc. But newsflash, more than half of Liberal voters felt the same way, and significant segments of NDP and Green voters in the 40% range also felt the same way. We then asked the question, okay, just numbers in general. How many immigrants should we be taking? Overall, the consensus answer, the plurality answer, is that our levels are about right. Some, about 10%, say it should be higher. The rest are in the range of giving numbers and ranges that are lower. But when you ask the question, and remember I said we would come back to this, the why, important to our economy, important to our society, or a burden, we ask the question, do you agree or disagree that Canada's economic growth is in peril without immigration? You can disagree with that. You can agree with that. The split here is hardly resounding. Yes, 60% agree our economy would be royally screwed without immigration. But again, you've got 40% who don't buy it, who aren't of that opinion, who disagree. Here's another statement. New immigrants take too many jobs away from Canadians. There's more consensus on this issue, a greater rejection of this point of view. 71% disagree with it. But again, you have 29%, nearly 3 in 10, who agree. And when I talk about percentages, and I didn't come to math naturally. Remember, I worked in television for a long time, so we don't do math. But think about how this applies to the number of Canadian adults in this country. You're talking about millions and millions of Canadian adults who hold these views on both sides. It can be easy to get away from what it really means, but in terms of hard numbers, that's what we're talking about. And then finally, as we get into what it all means and how it had an impact on the election, I will say to you that immigration, even though we thought it could be a ballot issue, it could be a really burning issue in this campaign, ended up not being an issue that people cast their ballots over. In part because you saw a cohesion among the main party leaders who were not necessarily, in fact, going to say that we need to reduce the numbers. Bernier tried that, lost his own seat. Andrew Scheer didn't really want to talk about it, but also was not out there espousing a reduction because, again, Conservatives need new Canadians to vote as well. And you saw the left of center espousing either holding the numbers where they are or increasing them. On that front, some about half saying the Trudeau government in the last 4 years has handled the immigration file well, the other half saying not such a good job. And again, when you look at it by political preference, again, what we see over and over again is partisan ideology, partisan preference being one of the biggest drivers on this issue. Conservative voters most likely to give him the worst marks, followed by Bloc voters. Voters on the left of center, among the Liberals, the NDPs, the Greens, more likely to be more forgiving. So here we are. We're in a minority situation, which means what the Liberals campaigned on is not necessarily what is going to come to pass, because we are now into what's known as the let's make a deal part of governance. As you may or may not know, the Prime Minister has been meeting with all of the opposition leaders in the last week or so, and basically sitting down and saying, hi, can I take your order? What can I do for you? And if he's smart, I think about the way one of the highest approval ratings in the last 4 years was squandered and squandered and squandered. So I question, as a political observer and someone who's looked at the data, whether this minority government is going to be skillfully handled, given that we saw a majority government, particularly in its last year, that was not so skillfully handled. But nonetheless, we're going to see a situation where compromises will have to be made. Some ideas will have to be abandoned. Others will come up to the forefront if there are other parties that are saying this is a big priority to us. When it comes to Liberal immigration policy, as I mentioned, what they campaigned on, now we're going to look to an increase to 350,000 immigrants by 2021. Andrew Scheer, as I mentioned, said that those targets seemed reasonable. For Jagmeet Singh and the NDP, the focus was not so much on pure numbers, but more on prioritizing family reunification and ending the cap on family applications for sponsorship. So you see the direction that party would like to go in, and I would signal to you that that may be something that is part of that let's make a deal scenario that we're going to be dealing with in this next several weeks as we wait to hear what comes out of the throne speech around December 5th. So I've just said that's what's next. So, yeah, probably should have put that first. And with that, we'll open it up to questions. As I say, what I haven't chatted with you about was the impact of the two influxes of irregular border crossers and then government-assisted refugees over the last 4 years. So maybe Henry and I can have a bit of a chat about that, and then I look forward to taking your questions.
Thank you. So I'd like to introduce our moderator this evening. Henry Yu is an associate professor of history and the principal of St. John's College at the University of British Columbia. His research and teaching have been built around collaboration with local communities and civil society at multiple levels. Having served on many committees that have been historically groundbreaking and transformative, Professor Yu is noted for his role in educating the public on the history and issues related to Asian migration and discrimination in Canada. He contributed to the background report on the historical context for BC's official apology in 2014 for its history of anti-Chinese legislation. Henry received his BA in history with honors from UBC and an MA and PhD in history from Princeton University. Over to you, Henry.
Thank you so much, Chris, and it's such an honor. I'm sorry that I got caught in traffic from UBC to here. It's a long way from Point Grey to here, and there's a lot of cars leaving and fleeing Point Grey. So my apologies for getting in a little bit late, but I did catch the whole talk, so thank you so much. do you want to just sit down and how's that? And we'll and so I'd love to open it up. I'm gonna actually the poppy is still on me. So
That should be on a wreath by now.
I was gonna say
you people
you people don't know what to do with the poppy. You're supposed to take it off, but
can at least pay a couple of bucks for it.
Yeah, exactly. There were so many things in there that was fascinating to me, listening to you and getting the opinions. And as before we open it up to everyone else, I thought, since I have the mic, there's a couple questions. One was, I was on CKNW responding to the Don Cherry firing, and one of the things that I brought up was that 19 out of 20 newcomers to Canada go to urban areas. So in some sense, what you are seeing also is our cities have changed from the 1970s in huge ways. So we have very diverse cities. But if you go to small town Canada, a lot of small prairie towns, Maritimes, actually things haven't changed much since the 1950s in these small towns. In fact, you could say that they've gotten smaller, that small town Canada is shrinking. That 1 in 5 of newcomers that go to small towns, they sometimes are they own a restaurant, or they end up being the doctor sometimes in that small town. But it hasn't transformed the demography of small towns. So I was wondering if in the polling data there is any reflection of that urban-rural kind of divide, whether attitudes towards immigrants. You see in the United States, for instance, that a lot of the anti-immigrant opinions and sentiments are actually based in places that don't see many immigrants. And so they have this sort of fantasy delusion of all these terrible things happening, but they actually don't know any newcomers, or the very few newcomers in the places they live. And so I wonder if there's a similar dynamic or not in the opinions.
So I think one of the, well, I don't just think it, I know it, but one of the most significant drivers around opinion on a lot of this is there is an urban-rural split, but of course, what in terms of the Venn diagram, what does that overlap with? Age. Age demographics are one of the biggest drivers in terms of the fractures that we're seeing on a bunch of levels in this country today, whether it's social values, whether it's fiscal policy, whether it's views on immigration, whether it's pipelines, whatever it is, the divide between, again, what we call progressive or more left of center thinking, and then views that are more right of center are very much based on a sense that for many people in this country and many people in these communities, they sense that the Canada they know, and I think it has a lot to do with what we heard on the weekend from Mr. Cherry. The Canada they know doesn't look like what they remember, and it feels a little uncomfortable. But what I would also say is when we've looked at issues of multiculturalism, of religious headgear, this is a time where in Quebec we're dealing with Bill 21, what region of the country was most accepting of, yes, you can wear the hijab in public, and you should wear your turban, and you should be a government servant and carry a kirpan? The Maritimes. The Maritimes are not exactly the most ethnically diverse part of the country, with apologies to any Maritimers in the room. That is not meant as a slight, but it's pretty vanilla. So as a result, I say good for maritime communities that we know stuck their hands up and said we'd like to take some of the Syrians if they'd like to come and settle here. But there's the realization that these communities, Henry, as you pointed out, are dying out. But it has a lot more to do with how old you are. At the same time, in places like BC, in urban BC, in the GTA, voices are divided on these issues. And again, interestingly, they are divided along demographic lines. You look at issues of accommodation, of speaking the language, of fitting in or integration, even blackface. There are generations of immigrants to this country who arrived in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And their lived experiences, I couldn't get a job. I couldn't get an apartment. People spat at me. They beat me up. I had a turban. I came here. I changed my name, and I cut my hair. And there is a sense among that generation that the people who are coming in after them should do the same, please and thank you very much. Whereas younger people who have grown up in this country or who came very young and at a time when Canada's views on a lot of these issues are changing and becoming a lot more accepting and progressive than they have been, are far more outraged. So blackface was a prime example of this, where young people I knew, sort of, 35 and younger, were tearing their hair out, lighting it on fire, and my uncles and aunties were all like, meh, what's the big deal? So that's more anecdotal than empirical, but I can tell you that if we did that study, that is what we'd find.
Interesting. I think I'm going to walk around and hand you a mic. So if you've got a question, please.
You could just
wave
throw
your
it
hand.
at them.
I could do that too. I
Might
don't know how
cause some
good.
injuries.
Any football players who can know how to catch a flying mic, but yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, so I have an observation, and I'm opening it up for comment, right? Yeah. So in one of your very early slides, it was by country, people that were thinking we should have more immigrants, and those top countries were like Canada, the UK, Australia. Those countries are hard to get to. Right? So we haven't had the same kind of influx that the European countries or even the United States has. And I really think that has a lot to do with our welcoming attitude. And I'm wondering what your comments about that are.
That's an excellent observation, and I would go back to a study that we did probably about a year ago, a little more than a year ago. It would have been the late summer of 2018 when we were noticing the phenomenon of the border crossers, and they were coming over at Roxham Road, and they were coming over in Manitoba and in BC and other parts of the country. But Roxham Road became this real focal point. Also, people were just coming in numbers that we had never seen before. And Canada had a national freak out about it. They literally lost their stuff. 2/3 thought it was a crisis. And, politicians say voters are never wrong, and I say perceptions are never wrong. If you perceive it to be a crisis, then it's got to be dealt with either in terms of the way our policymakers and our politicians are explaining this and putting into perspective and saying, actually, we're dealing with like infinitesimal decimal dust of percentage of population. Or saying, look, we're on it, we're taking care of it. That's why we saw the appointment of Bill Blair as Minister of Border Security almost immediately as soon as those numbers came out. I think they came out just a day before that happened. Canada has been buffeted by two giant oceans in the Arctic Circle when it comes to people just walking into the country. Europeans are used to it. Americans are very used to it. And those are not the only places that deal with influxes of humanitarian migrants or economic migrants. You think about the Indian subcontinent, people are coming in from Bangladesh all the time. They're coming in from Pakistan and other parts of the country, parts of the region going, yeah, there's a cyclone. I think I'd like to live here now. So other countries are very seasoned. And they have their views. But this was a new phenomenon for Canada. And it was something we had never dealt with before. And the reaction to it was a reaction of anxiety and fear. And yes, certainly a number of people saying, look, we understand, particularly among the irregular border crossers, that, this isn't, we understand why they're coming, but we don't think that this is the right way to come. There was also, by the way, as much division over the acceptance of Syrian refugees. This was something, again, in terms of the media narrative around it and the political narrative around it, that if you had questions over the timelines or the numbers who were coming in or around the vetting process, Kathleen Wynne at the time tweeted it, basically said it was racist to question the process and the plan. I don't think that's very healthy in terms of having a healthy debate around immigration. You've got to be able to ask questions and be able to answer them cogently and persuasively, and if that's not happening, then there's a problem. You've got to be able to say, yes, we have a plan. Yes, 3 months sounds really tight. Maybe we should extend those timelines, which is ultimately what the government did. But I would agree with you. Canada just is not used to uncontrolled immigration. We are used to either government-assisted refugee support, and we are used to a very tight door approach to immigration. Yeah. So, well, and there are those who would say, and the fact of the matter is, as a result, whether we agree with it or not, Canada chooses some of the best. So per capita, when we look at other OECD countries, Canada has some of the wealthiest, most educated newcomers coming into this country, particularly in the economic class. When you look at rates and statistics around home ownership in the first 10 years of their arrival, if you look at employment within the first 10 years of their arrival, those outcomes are much higher than they are in countries where the door is more open, because we're choosing to, not take people that we don't see as employable or as ready to stand on their own feet.
Actually, I was as I'm walking over, I just want to ask you about that, because it was interesting that Trump and several others raised a Canadian-style point system for the United States, and that became, quite a debate in the United States as, oh, that's horrible that you're going to restrict. And it was interesting to think about Canadians, which have a very selective policy, the point system that does give points for economic professions, needed professions, and your educational level and things like that, that we are used to actually a highly selective system, one that we accept, and yet it does have actually other kinds of impacts. So for instance, would you say that people are aware that in places like Vancouver, that wealthy migrants are now blamed in some sense in many people's minds, and some of that anti-immigration sensibility is because people with wealth, creating a hot real estate market or speculative real estate market is some of the anti-immigrant sentiment, in other words, in some sense the result of a selective policy that does create a selectivity for wealth and education.
Wow, I could do a whole hour on that. I'm going to defer that answer to if we have more time.
Has the mix in class of immigrant changed in the past, in the recent past, between family reunification, refugee, economic?
That's an excellent question. Chris, do you want to take that?
The proportion that are the different classes, economic versus refugee.
On the humanitarian side, it has remained around the 10 to 12% for decades.
So what's changed then is the visibility around it.
Yeah.
What's changed is the visibility, and that's across the board. Family reunification versus economic class versus refugee class. Everyone's just been coming. What's changed in the last 4 years are two distinct phenomenon. One was the politicization and what became a bidding war in the late summer, early fall of 2015 around the humanitarian crisis unfolding in front of us with people trying to escape Syria. And you had Stephen Harper first saying we need to deal with the problem in country, and then saying, okay, we'll take 10,000. And then Justin Trudeau says, well, no, we're going to take 25,000. And I believe, if my memory serves me correctly, Tom Mulcair then said, no, we're going to take 40,000. Do I have 50? So this is in the middle of an election campaign. This is how we were making policy. So the visibility on that front, combined with the absolute visibility of cameras trained on, whether it's Mile Zero or Roxham Road, of people because of the Trump administration saying we're going to try our luck in Canada, we're going to walk across the border, have given people in this country more eyeballs and more awareness and more attention on an issue they haven't really been thinking about in the last many years. I mean, immigration is, in terms of a top-of-mind issue for Canadians, has been nowhere. And then it kind of shot to the top in the last 2 years, and now it's sort of back in the middle of the pack. But it's a fraction of awareness. It's a snapshot. It's not the whole picture. I don't expect Canadians to get out of bed thinking about the split of what percentage of what class is coming. I really don't. People have better things to do with their lives. But what it has done, I think, and you saw that from the numbers on that slide, it's given a far greater and far outsized view of the number of refugees coming to the country versus the actual numbers.
Here and there. Chris, you want to? Is it right on
No,
this one? Yeah.
Is it time for a Royal Commission on Immigration or a white paper on immigration? Like, you know, the level of understanding, the debate, but also the accelerated change and diversity, the numbers, the reliance on our future economic prosperity. Do we need something that other countries have been doing, you know, a broader policy engagement piece with
Oh,
Canadians?
hell, I'm not a politician. I don't know.
A personal opinion.
It's never my opinion. It's always your opinion. So I think that's an excellent question to put to Canadians. But I think that there could be, a lot of good that comes out of it. But we've also seen what happens. We've seen it in Quebec. We've seen it with the commissions on and the hearings on reasonable accommodations. Sometimes you get some toothpaste out of a tube that you just can't put back in. So there's two sides to that.
Over here. Yeah.
And then this gentleman over here. Thank you.
How much do you think that the questions that we Canadians are polled with or used how much do you think that the questions unnecessarily polarize?
Well, you're
us?
talking to the person who wrote the survey, so I don't think so.
Okay,
Right?
because one of the questions that came up for me was the language question. While I have experience teaching language, and I think that we all have the capacity to learn it, it's interesting how we're asked, do we think that people should have some ability, some language before they come? Yeah. And in the case of particularly refugees and those with lower literacy levels, it's an interesting question, I think, because
but remember in that question we excluded refugees from it.
Was it excluded? Okay,
it was.
That's helpful. Okay,
Yeah.
it's good because that's where I was thinking. Oh, well, and I guess maybe I missed that. Where do those questions potentially create? We create an answer, but we don't necessarily know all the facts before we answer them, and how much information do we get before we answer them? I just wondered about the meta behind some of the questions, and thought maybe you could talk about that.
So it's a good question to talk about just in terms of the work. I can only speak for the work we do. We take a lot of care in terms of the questions that we ask. Now and by the way, I get that a lot around, well, you shouldn't, or if the question is what's driving the answer. But how else would we rephrase that question? How do you get to something around that? So the intention is always to provide as much context around the issue. That was why we deliberately said with the exception of refugees in this case, because these are the people with the least ability to make any plans for whether they're coming, whereas other would-be immigrants would know as part of their application, well, there may be some expectation to try and learn before you come. We did not use the words around a language test. We didn't say should people be fluently bilingual. We said some ability. And why did we ask that question? Because it's something that comes up over and over and over again around questions of integration, in terms of questions around quote unquote fitting in, language and the shared ability to have that commonality with words and expressions is something that we see coming up over and over again, so we wanted to test it.
So I'm going to interject a live stream audience question from Melanie.
Okay.
And the first was a kind of factual. That 15% number that who are refugees, is that on decided cases? So that's 15% is those who were allowed in after their cases were considered. Is it a product of that, or is also pending cases, or what's the
that's a
turn
far
down?
better question for someone in the government department responsible.
Okay.
But
Yeah.
as we understand it, as the government of Canada set their targets and their limits and their quotas for the year, For 2019, the quota was to accept of the big pot, 15% would be under the refugee or the humanitarian class.
So this is a kind of follow-up from Melanie. In your opinion, if given the appropriate authority to address or come up with a policy regulating fair entry to Canada, how would you address the issue on irregular
Is there a
border
deputy
crossings?
minister in the house?
So how would you solve the issues of irregular border crossings or have the appropriate
Is there a
policy?
former civil servant in the house? It is. So one of the things I'll just point out at the beginning of our conversation, I said that the one thing that the Institute doesn't do, and I won't do tonight in my capacity as an agent of our organization, is advocate for policy or set policy. What we are genuinely trying to do is further a more informed discussion on these issues. I agree that it's complex, but I'm going to take the swerve on that one.
One of the more controversial, I would say, topics that has come up of late in the area of immigration is the whole notion of introducing a values test. And I'm wondering if recent polling has shown any patterns in terms of which segments of the Canadian population are most inclined to support that kind of notion and those that are not at all in support of that kind of notion.
So we haven't polled nationally specifically on the values test. The closest we've come has been on some of the other policies that have come out of Quebec, specifically around Bill 21, and also on the issue of how much control or say should individual provinces have on setting immigration policy. So I don't have any data on that particular question, but again, we saw some pretty dramatic numbers based on political partisanship and ideology that I think pretty clearly demarcates where who stands where on this issue in terms of how they vote. And I'll fill in a few other blanks. Who votes Conservative, who was more likely to vote Conservative in this last election? They tended to be people more over the age of 45. They skewed less urban, and they skewed more male in terms of their demographics. So I'm not trying to paint it, folks with a single brush, but demographically speaking, the values test question is a really interesting question to ask. What I can say on Quebec and the values test, as well as Bill 21, is Quebecers they are an outlier. They are a distinct society in terms of how they view assimilation, integration, and all of it comes back to the notion of Quebec as a nation and the desire to preserve French and Quebecois culture at all costs. So when you look at how Canadians feel about greater diversity or change in society, there are still divisions and demarcations and moments of profound discomfort, and I don't blame people for that in English Canada. But in French Canada, it's a line, and whether you are voting Quebec Solidaire on the extreme left-hand side of the political spectrum, or if you're voting for the CAQ, which is about as right as it gets in Quebec, people are firmly in support of Bill 21. They are quite supportive of the values test because there is a sense that we are Quebecers absolutely first.
Okay, we have a question back here.
Thank you very much. I'm one of those retired civil servants who spent about 20 years.
Come on up, sir.
And you're provoking a lot of memories and recognition that when I first met Chris for the first time when he started
Are you having
lobbying me.
flashbacks?
I'm having, yes.
So is there a lot of triggering
Post-traumatic
going on
syndrome,
here?
yeah. But in the data you showed today, one of the most dramatic factors that I witnessed that's been analyzed in the changing policy over the last 20 years is moving from a general notion of a 60-40 split economic family, sort of legislated targets, and then you get into the granular of how precise they are. But and also we also need to recognize that Quebec has an entirely distinct and
Absolutely.
unique, so they're off the map in terms of the rest of the discussion. But for me, the most interesting analysis I've seen is the shift politically from moving from immigration as nation building. And I can tell you 20 years ago, if you went to a roundtable about immigration, you'd be talking about nation building and shared values. And then in the early 2000s, the shift went to economic, and at all levels, provincially, PNP program, foreign trained workers. Even today, in the last few days, the Asia Pacific Foundation is promoting specifically targeting Asia Pacific high-tech workers. So just in the weeds of this, unfortunately, is this notion when people talking about what is the purpose, and I agree with Chris, we should have a purpose in immigration. Every group, every team, every business decides who's in and who's out for particular strategic reasons. And we don't have that conversation. And the analysis that Naomi Albion did, a very detailed analysis of policy shift, is in the last decade when the employer started deciding who's getting into the country. So we shifted from this community-based discussion about nation building and who you want your neighbor to be to really meeting the needs of the economy. And I think that discussion continues. And I think that's what's missing in the analysis. I'm always amazed when I see conservatives pushing back on immigration, when you would think that would be the business community pushing for economic immigration.
So let me fill that in a little bit, and thank you for the question and the comment. Conservatives are an interesting lot because when you ask them particularly about the economic class and about immigration, conservatives are the most likely to say we need more economic class immigrants. They're also the most likely to say we need fewer. And their opinions on it are very strong and very evenly divided. So the base there, because in general, the blue tent in this country is this uneasy alliance between sort of more social conservative traditionalists, faith-based folks, and then folks who just don't want to see Canada change. And then you've got the deregulators, the small government types, the free enterprise enthusiasts who are like, do whatever we have to do to get the economic engine of this country cooking. And so as a result, that is where you see actually a split on the question of economic immigration among the conservative base. It's an interesting point. I wasn't around for the policy discussions of the 1980s. I was watching Bert and Ernie. But what I would say is, yes, what has been very interesting about the political framing and packaging of the immigration question in the last 5 years is that it was a little bit back to the future. It was almost as though the government of the day took the playbook of, Pierre Elliott Trudeau in the 1980s and said, on housing, we're going to do this because that's what we did in 79. And on immigration, we're going to do this because that's what we did in 79. And it's all going to work. And I would suggest that after 25 years of conditioning under successive conservative, liberal, conservative governments, Canadians have very much skewed their view and value of immigration as, if we want nice things, if we want health care, if we want a tax base that's going to pay for the nice lives that we have, we need people coming to the country. And it is much more a value proposition based on that than it is on we should nation build. I think today many Canadians feel like, to an extent, the nation is built. Not that we shouldn't have more people coming, but we've got a pretty good base set down.
Maybe as a quick follow-up to that, one of the interesting things about the chart that you showed was Chrétien to Harper, and that under the Harper government, you actually did not see a fall-off in terms of the numbers.
You saw absolutely. The fall-off came with people forget things. They forget that the big closing of the door happened post-1993 under the Chrétien government. Under Harper, it was, we've got to keep this engine going, and we're going to keep people coming in.
So I'm going to ask maybe a question that didn't show up in your polling, but one of the interesting things about the Kinney strategy, actually, was Jason Kinney, not Harper as much, was to appeal to suburban evangelicals who were dominated in places like outskirts of Vancouver and Richmond and Burnaby, outside of Toronto in suburban, who were actually dominated by Chinese, Korean newcomers, tended to be these big suburban mega churches at times, and that Kenny strategy of actually peeling off socially conservative, you mentioned in your talk, newcomers who are non-white, who are from Asia, that actually worked for 2 cycles of elections, and yet that seems to have been lost. Is that due to, in some sense, to a perception about immigration in the polling data, or that kind of key demographic within that conservative coalition, which were newcomers who were evangelical. Where does religion and evangelical social conservatism play in terms of immigration attitudes?
Oh my God.
That's a, yeah. Yeah, exactly.
So, the Conservatives did not lose that new Canadian diversity multicultural base. It showed up for them as much as it showed up for the Liberals. I always like to say that Jason Kenney figured out how to eat the Liberals' lunch by going and eating lunch with anyone that would eat lunch with him, and he did it in every mosque, every synagogue, every gurdwara, every church. He ate a lot of lunch. What the Liberals were able to do at the end of 3 terms and 10 years of austerity government was appeal to voters, including voters in multicultural new Canadian communities who might have been swing voters at that point and thinking about a change anyway. Because remember, voting blocks, like ethnic voters don't vote as a monolith. They're not a block. Young voters don't vote as a block. Coastal voters, city voters, rural voters, they don't vote as blocks. So there was probably a lot of people who voted Conservative in 3 terms and went, yeah, I'm kind of done with this guy anyway. And Trudeau was able to tap in. He trotted Mr. Chrétien out, and it sort of really appealed to, remember me, I'm the kid, and you loved my dad, and you loved Chrétien, and you're going to love me too. And remember what I said also earlier about age demographics. You had a bunch of younger voters who were the children of immigrants, who were like, that's great that you keep voting for all this austerity because you were also really strict with the household finances when we were growing up for good reason, but we want stuff now, and so we're going to vote left. Yeah.
Or else I'm just going to keep on asking these
Oh
really
God,
complicated
please no,
questions.
somebody ask something.
Yeah, exactly. There's another thought that I was having watching, you put out the slides, which was that change in Canada, that really is this post-68 set of changes. I mean, you could say we are the product of it. My parents came in 65, so I was born in 67, so I was a little bit before it, but almost everyone who came after the points system was installed. So it's interesting to think about why there seems such support for economic migrants and those who are the target, family unification and economic migrants. We were produced by that, you could say. The new Canada was produced by then. Going back to, I think, Chris's, what if we were to have this discussion, in some sense, where do you see voices who want to see change? I mean, are there people who were produced by this as newcomers and their children who actually disagree with this kind of highly selective policy that is based around family unification and economic migration? One of the examples I would say is the business migrant program, which again was severely curtailed. This idea that entrepreneurs and people with money should be given a fast track, that seemed to be really universally loathed, especially among those who came in under the point system, that it seemed to be a kind of queue jumping by wealthy people. And so in some sense, who are the people who are really going to advocate for a major change if we had this white paper and this commission, the Royal Commission? Like, where do you see in these opinion polls a set of people who really want to see some kind of fundamental change?
Again, I would go back to the fact that people don't roll out of bed in the morning thinking about immigration.
Right.
They have opinions when they're asked about it, and sometimes it is a little bit more top of mind than others. But again, you go back to the 68% in this country who say that immigration overall is a good thing. It's a net benefit for the country. We need immigrants to keep our economy going, and it makes us a better part of the country. Absolutely, it makes us a better country for it. I think you've touched on something, and I've mentioned it too a couple of times this evening, which is populations are not monoliths, and that goes for our parents' generations who came and they had to work crappy jobs that they were totally overqualified for, but they built their homes and they raised their kids and they sent them all to university whether they wanted to go or not. I wanted to go. All I wanted was a gap year. No. So, but you will find, and I'm speaking purely anecdotally now. This is anecdotal and this is not empirical, but it pops up over and over again in a very anecdotal way. I will be with the cabbie coming in from the Calgary airport, and he's someone who's emigrated from Somalia or from India, from Punjab, and has been here for 20 years and is railing about the fact that refugees to the country are given a stipend of so many dollars per month, and that's not fair, and what the hell is up with that, and we need to close the door on that because I never got no money every month. I had to make it work. So again, what you are seeing is a difference, and it crosses and intersects with so many lines on questions of culture and integration and immigration, where a generation that's been here 20, 30, 40 years and perceives the path for them has been hard or as easy as it's been, does not like to see the road being easier for those who are, we call it the drawbridge effect. We've seen that where often immigrants are the ones who are, and we've seen this in the UK. There's a community called Slough outside of London, which was one of the highest rates of in the Brexit vote to leave. Why did the people of Slough want to leave? Because there's too many immigrants. Slough had the highest percentage of immigration. So the people who were voting to leave were immigrants. And they were like, there's too many immigrants. And the reporter on the BBC is like, but you're an immigrant. It's like, yeah, but now there's too many. So these are factors. These are factors. And what it means is this is not a white, non-white issue. This is not, I see this as so much more of a generational issue than anything else.
So I work in local government at City Hall, and a lot of the public policy at local government is impacted by the challenges of public perception related to immigration. We have communities that are now shutting down the development of housing because of the wealthy immigrant or the perception that the wealthy immigrant came and stole the housing from their children. So they're shutting down the development of housing, hoping that would stop the wealthy immigrant from ending up with. And that doesn't make sense, but we're still left with the fact that half of Metro Vancouver will no longer meet its housing targets as a means of making housing more affordable, which is obviously.
I'm giving a speech on housing on Monday, so why don't you just come to that?
Okay. So to what extent? I mean,
I'm kidding.
So the public, oh yeah, you completely wrecked it now. The public perception of immigration affects not just federal policy. Obviously, it affects local government policies and all kinds of other public policy that affects my children's ability to get housing not because of the immigrant, but because of the perception of the immigrant, and therefore the way we change that. I guess I'm not even asking a question. I was going to ask a question, then you said that I got to come to this Monday
No, ask
thing.
the question.
We have a council meeting on Monday, so I'm not going to be able to make your thing. But well, yeah. Well, we know that the drawbridge syndrome is often called the country club syndrome, which is after you've joined the country club, you don't want them to lower the price. You want them to raise the price. I've already made it. I'm in this community. We can close the gates now. That sort of approach. And some of that in Coquitlam and in other communities is the immigrant that doesn't want has arrived and doesn't want to see prices continue to rise because of demand increasing, and their perception is it's increasing because of immigration.
So it's come up a couple times, so I'll speak to that right now. I would say that at the beginning of what was perceived as a housing crisis, and well, let's face it, you could call it a crisis, and people still in this region call it a crisis. Initially, a lot of it had to do with the perception of foreign ownership. And that was then equated with a perception or a conversation that, well, it's inherently racist to question the role of foreign money in the market. I think where the nuances have evolved to is that now the suspicion, the cynicism, call it whatever you want, is no longer about foreigners in the housing market, because who are the foreigners? They're us. And now it's more about foreign capital. And we have seen with the evolution of conversations around money laundering and some of the revelations we've learned in the last couple of years about how capital has flown in and flowed into this market, that it's, and Richard, you will know better at the local government level. You know what you're hearing at council. But what I can say is, based on what we're seeing now, it's less about it's Chinese immigrants or Chinese people and more about money coming from China. I think that is the place or the arc that we've seen move over the last 4 or 5 years in terms of general public opinion.
But they still didn't tax money from China. They taxed speculation because that's more evil.
You're just a pollster.
Just a pollster. Just a pollster.
I know.
So sad. Oh, thank
Okay.
you, Henry. Come and sit with me.
International students. So 2018, over 550,000, probably 575,000 are in Canada right now. 8 billion to the economy. So what, have you done any polling around that? What Canadians' perception, Canadian residents' perception of the unbridled growth of international students that are accessing and helping, in a strange way, propping up our public education system?
Oh, it's not
Contrib-
strange that that's what
No.
they're doing.
And
Yeah.
and the post-secondary, and the perception occasionally that the international student is taking the spot of a
Well,
domestic.
that's, yeah.
So what can you say about polling in that whole area?
I don't know, unless Maclean's has done it, I don't know of any polling that's been done on that issue. Again, when we talk about the number of people affected by it, who are you going to do a poll with if you want to do a really effective poll on this? You're going to have to poll Canadian parents of kids between the ages of 17 and 24, right? Because they're the ones most affected and probably most alive to the issue. The rest of us are all like, So on that front, yes, those are probably the two things. And from a public policy standpoint, certainly everyone can weigh in, but the greatest sense of heightened concern will probably be among those who are worried about their own children or grandchildren getting a place in a university. And certainly, I mean, again, if you look at what's happened in British Columbia, between the mid-1980s, where you graduated from high school locally and you had a place at UBC or at SFU, or if your marks weren't good enough, then you had to go to Kwantlen, right? That was the deal. To a place now where British Columbian students are headed to the Maritimes, and they are headed to Ontario, and they're headed to other places because the quality of competition to get in, and certainly the number of spaces as a result of spaces being taken up by international students, leads to it's just a little bit harder. Now, there is a trade-off there. You explained that trade-off. Their money makes universities go. We could do a whole poll on university funding.
Yeah.
We could have a whole discussion about that.
Yeah.
But it's an interesting one. I'll add it to the list.
And we're going to have Chris be given that privilege of the last question, because I am aware that it's after 7, and one of the jobs of the moderator is to cut things off.
Oh, you've done such a good
yeah,
job.
Yeah, exactly, cutting people off. So I'm going to actually thank our speaker for the night for all the stimulating information, but also her willingness to venture into some opinions of her own about what she's saying these numbers are very hard to interpret in many cases, and I think the gift of a good pollster is to actually both ask good questions that elicit useful answers, but also then to read, patterns and trends into those numbers. And so thank you so much for interpreting those numbers for us and to respond to our questions, some of the questions came probably out of left field. But
They were fun.
yeah. But thank you so much, and I'm going to pass it back to Chris to...
So again, thank you to Henry and to Shachi for a very stimulating evening, and I hope you've all enjoyed it. This is the last of our three-part series. We would love to have your feedback. This is the first time that we've done such a series, and so there is a 3-question survey that you hope you'll complete on our behalf. There is more information about ISS at BC on the table in the middle there, including this poster that we created earlier this year. We welcome, if you are so wish, take some back to Coquitlam, perhaps. Feel free to take many of these posters as you deem fit. And we're hoping to learn from this experience and offer it again next year as part of a closer look at the multidimensional aspects of immigration. I think we can all learn, as we have tonight, around how complicated it is, the multidimensional aspects, but it really does provide an opportunity, a safe environment, both in person and online, to delve deeper, and we appreciate all of your participation. There are light refreshments and sandwiches in the back. I know that you came, some of you, prior to the start of this, so please help yourself, and thank you very much.
And the gentleman who had another question, maybe come up informally, and I'm sure.
Hi there. I am a teacher, and I teach English geography as well. So it's based on